Hello and welcome to Château de Fontaine-Henry. This chateau has often been described as a Loire chateau lost in Normandy. In reality, the Renaissance aspect is misleading. It's a medieval chateau built in 1200, a castral complex comprising a large chapel in the primitive Gothic style, a dwelling which is here. You can see the drawing, and there was a large room at my back, and this large room disappeared at the end of the 100 Years' War. I don't know exactly under what circumstances. But after the Great Hall was destroyed, a Châtelet was erected here. This rather large main building, which was actually used to go higher to see further. Because the shoreline had retreated, you had to go higher, but originally this Châtelet didn't have its roofs. The only proof of this is the fact that the very last dormer window you see in the large roofs corresponds to a very fine bedroom, so it wasn't at all the architecture we're looking at today. This was modified under the reign of François I by Pierre Doon, who carried out gigantic works which he entrusted to an architect, Blaise Le Prêtre, an architect well known to people interested in alchemy, because he built the Hôtel d'Escoville in Caen, which is the present-day tourist office, built by Nicolas Levallois d'Escoville, well known in the world of alchemy. So there's a link, a cronyism, if you'll pardon the expression, between these people. And Pierre Doon had Blaise Le Prêtre, who was staying here for the work, come and visit us. And we discovered by the merest chance that the sculptures that had been placed on these facades were alchemical sculptures. When I learned of this, I went to look in all the parts of the chateau built by the D'Harcourt family and discovered evidence of alchemy under Charles VIII, Louis XII, and François I. It's very exciting, except that I don't know anything about alchemy, and I'm now obliged to try and find some sort of masters. So I suggest you follow me, and then we'll discover a little about the succession of owners of the seigneury and then of the chateau. So, Charles VIII, here we're under Louis XII, the alchemical decor that we'll also find in the chapel. We have this character with a mustache, sideburns, and a beard, known as the Green Man or Nature Naturante. If you Google Green Man, you'll find masks all over the place, and interestingly enough, it also resembles the god Belinus, whom Asterix and Obelix called Belenos, and that's interesting because I have a Scottish name, Williamson, and there's a Belenos line in England, which is a virtual line drawn by the Roman legions to avoid getting lost between Scotland and the Isle of Wight. They had drawn a virtual line on which are all the great symbolic monuments of England and Scotland, including the Rosslyn Chapel. And when you continue this line on the mainland, where do you end up? Fontaine-Henry. Try to make sense of it. It amuses me. We've now arrived in the grand vestibule, which wasn't always a grand vestibule. But we won't go into all the details here. I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that the mantelpiece is carved and painted with the coats of arms of all the families who have owned this seigneury or this property from 1200 years ago to the present day. It was my grandfather who had this mantel paneling made, which was in fact the hearth of the Great Hall that disappeared at the end of the 100 Years' War, but it wasn't a very practical fireplace measuring 6 meters by 3. We'll start with the Tilly family, who died out during the 100 Years' War. Following the Tillys are the well-known D'Harcourts, the branch of the current Duc d'Harcourt, the so-called Beuvron branch, an eminently powerful branch with the title of Duke, while the eldest branch has the title of Marquis. Then you have the Moret, 16th, 17th century, Breton, Boutillier Château d'Assy. You can see their ermines. The Monteclair, a family from Caen that still exists. They may no longer be in Caen, but in any case, it's a family that exists, that passes on to the Margueries, that still exists. I've had Margueries among my visitors. Nowadays, the name is spelled with a Y. This is the time of the revolution. The chatelaine here, who has seigniorial rights, is a person who didn't marry. Her name is Louise Marie Henriette de Marguerite de Vassy, and she is protected by the people of Fontaine-Henry, who don't want her to be shortened. That was the term. And she just has to have the coat of arms in the chateau or on the facades hammered out to avoid displaying her nobility, which would be a little prejudicial. She adopted a nephew named Henri de Carbonel de Canicy, who was an absolutely fanatical collector of paintings. He has a marvelous collection. He has collected, I counted, 500 engravings. But in 1972, we're going to be burgled, and 22 of these paintings are going to be stolen, as well as 2 porcelains. And one day, I'm even going to receive a visit from the son of the head burglar, who's going to come and confess, as it were, because he was fed up with a family who did nothing but commit acts of violence. He once said, during a violent family succession, since that's the way it is, I'm going to tell the police and the victims everything I know. I didn't find the item stolen in 72, but I'm still happy to have had this sort of confession, especially as in 72, my grandmother was still in this world. It gave her such a shock that I was told she wasn't quite the same person. I wasn't there, and she stumbled one evening on her way back to her room and never got up again. So this burglary went far beyond the loss of material objects. My grandmother was born Hermine de Cornulier, daughter of Jean and granddaughter of Gontran de Cornulier. Does Cornulier ring a bell if you know anything about horse racing? Well, yes. Jean de Cornulier, my grandfather, and Gontran, my great-grandfather, were both presidents of racecourses, of the Société d'Encouragement du Cheval de Demi-Cent, which presided over the destiny of the entire trotting industry. Trotting races were created by Gontran de Cornulier, the Marquis de Croix, and a number of other people who were enthusiasts of hunting and coursing. They realized that the War of 1870, the first war against Germany, was impoverishing the French countryside, and they had to find additional income for the peasants, whatever the cost. So what do? We can't enlarge their fields. So what do? Make them breed racehorses. Yes, but not thoroughbreds. They're much too fragile. Trotters. Now, we were hunters at coursing. We were horsemen at coursing. So what do? We trot very fast and very long. So we have horses with speed and stamina. The battered farm at the other end of the village of Fontaine-Henry became a major producer of trotting foals. We also set up race courses to promote these breeding farms locally and create a kind of cursus honorum for them by having the foals take part in small races. Then, when they win one, we move on to a slightly bigger race course. So you have Cabourg, Lisieux, Caen, Charolles, Vincennes. And it's at Vincennes that on the last Sunday in January, the World Championship of Mounted Trotting is held, the Prix de Cornulier, in memory of these characters. But we mustn't forget that the origins of this passion with social and constructive repercussions lie in Ville. So we're not dealing with the preconceived notion of a veigneur who looks down on the lower classes from the height of his contempt, and so on. Not at all. We make common cause with the peasantry. We come from the peasantry. And that's something very satisfying, I mean. And Jean de Cornulier's son-in-law was Pierre d'Oliançon, my grandfather, who came here in 1898 by marriage. And Pierre d'Oliançon is one of the names of the Farmers' Union, one of the founders. You'll find his name at the Maison du Paysan in Paris, and in monographs on farmers' mutualism. As it happens, my grandfather couldn't get around. He was a one-legged man. He had an employee called Jacques Leroy-Ladurie, and Jacques Leroy-Ladurie's mission was to go from the departmental capital to the canton capital to explain to farmers that they shouldn't be left alone to defend their interests in isolation, that they should band together. Well, the whole of peasant mutualism was born of this, and Jacques Leroy-Ladurie did his job extremely well. When the 39-45 war broke out, he came to say goodbye to my grandfather, saying, "I've heard that General de Gaulle is continuing the war from England, and I'm going to join him." My grandfather said to him, "Above all, don't do that. Don't abandon the countryside because the Germans are requisitioning all the harvests and sending everything to Germany. Don't abandon your union members. On the contrary, help them to pull together, to keep their links, and you have to save the population of Paris because without harvests, it won't be possible to supply Paris. And Jacques de Roy-Ladurie imposed himself on Maréchal Pétain as Minister of Agriculture and Supply, and he organized as best he could a makeshift supply operation. Of course, it was under the very nose of the occupying forces, but he did the job, as they say, and then resigned afterwards. So this participation in social history, I must say, I'm proud of it. And I want to do justice to the remarkable intuitions of previous generations without clichés. So now, if you'll follow me, let's go to the Salon. We've got Gothic architecture here at Charles VIII, which means I can sometimes welcome young stonemasons, boys or girls, who come to make dimension sketches for their exams, etc. And I'm very proud to be able to contribute in this way to the blossoming of certain vocations for stonemasons and people in the fine trades, cabinet makers, gilders, picture restorers, and so on. I think that in our chateau, we should always mention the people who made the objects we have in front of us. It's all very well to know the styles, the battles, the great figures, but at the heart of it all, there are tradesmen and sometimes tradeswomen. We need to reread Jeanne Bourrin's Chambre des Dames to realize the extent to which women are involved in the art of living and the making of beautiful objects. Here we are in the first salon. This is the family salon, the only one that can be heated, I must say, and we are greeted by a painting that wasn't always there. It's a painting that comes from Brussels, from my grandfather's, and it has quite a history. It's actually a copy of a painting entitled L'éducation de l'amour, which is in the National Gallery of Art in London. The copy was made in Rome by a certain Pierre-Paul Rubens, no less. And it was in Belgium at my grandfather's after having been at the Château de la Muette in Paris. It had been bought by the d'Orléans along with the Château de la Muette, but the previous owners were no less important, for this painting had actually been commissioned for the King of Bohemia and had been present at the royal castle in Prague, then bought by Queen Christine of Sweden, who had abdicated to end her days in Rome. She didn't take much with her, but this painting was part of the move. And it was after that, in circumstances that I haven't been able to elucidate, that the d'Orléans bought it. So there's a whole chain of events. And the Château de la Muette, where it finally stood at the time of the 1914 war, belonged to the Hérard family of piano maker Sébastien Hérard, with whom I'm related. And because there was a German firebombing of the Château de la Muette at the time of the 1914 war, which set everything ablaze, we took out everything we could, including this painting, which went to the Belgian part of the family, and that's how it ended up in Normandy. Can you see the circuit? It's very simple, isn't it? There, lying on the floor waiting to be hung up, is a portrait of my grandfather Pierre Doon, whom I mentioned earlier as one of the fathers of peasant mutualism. The eldest of my uncles, he was mayor of Fontaine-Henry during the 39-45 war, while my father was a prisoner in Silesia in a place called Little Siberia, where he stayed, excuse me, for 5 years, moping around and waiting for things to happen with a rather detrimental lack of food. Here we arrive in the Grand Salon, greeted by the 9-year-old Sun King, Louis XIV. This painting by Pierre Mignard is an allegory intended to show that even as a child, the king is a warrior. He is dressed to represent the god Mars. You see, he has all the weapons, all the symbols, all the attributes of the god Mars, and his shield is even dented, which means it's been in battle. But it's been pointed out to me that there's a disproportion between the bust and the legs of the young boy. And this is deliberate because in reality, the mistake here is to have presented this painting vertically, whereas it's meant to be tilted, which corrects the perspective and restores the proportions of the body. So this is a work by Pierre Mignard. We have a number of paintings that are very remarkable, in particular this one, which is the portrait, I specify the portrait, of the front of Maria Serre, the mother of the painter Hyacinthe Rigaud, while the Louvre has both profiles on the same canvas, and here are the two profiles on the right-hand page. And this enabled the Versailles sculptor Coisevaux to create the marble bust that you can see on the left side. And we know another artwork related to it, which is a copy made by Géricault, Théodore Géricault, the Norman painter of Le Radeau de la Méduse, and this copy is now in the Musée des Beaux-Arts in Dijon. But it so happens that very recently I had the opportunity to buy another copy of this painting, and that I'm going to put it in a gallery that I have to redo for safety reasons, because this gallery presents a major fire risk insofar as the electricity is old, and there is a hanging that absolutely must be changed so as not to risk setting the chateau ablaze from there. And so I'm going to turn it into the Galerie de Canisy in memory of Henri de Canisy, the collector I mentioned earlier, thanks to whom we have all these works of art. So this copy I've just bought is absolutely charming. It was made in about 1820. It's in an original 19th century frame. And I'm going to tell this story by asking myself the questions. Who made this copy? It's not signed. Was it made here or elsewhere? But where was the original at the time? Was it a friend of Géricault's? He had a friend called Charlie. Maybe it's Charlie's. Let's find out. Here we have, I'd say, a piece of wool, and we're pulling to see if there isn't a whole ball of yarn. And in the middle of the ball, there may be some question marks. It's a detective story in a way, and it makes castle life, I must say, a lot of fun. And we're always happy to share these little things. There you are. Now, if you'll follow me, we'll get on with the tour. I was referring to Jean de Cornulier. I don't know if the picture is sufficiently illuminated to see it. Jean de Cornulier, my great-grandfather. Here, he's in his Venere outfit. The painting needs a little restoration. You could see the silhouette of the Château de Fontaine-Henry right next to the mouth of his trunk. But it's a portrait by a painter called Hornecker. This was given to him on the occasion of his 1000th stag. But it's important to remember that hunting with hounds is directly linked to an intimate relationship with the countryside, nature, and social history. And that's what's important. So here we have a painting of a cripple from the Napoleonic Wars. I'm waiting to see who did it. Is it Charlie? Is it Géricault? It's Géricault's entourage in any case. The collector of paintings is Henri de Carbonel de Canisy. With small paintings of his own, he painted as an amateur. He wasn't a bad painter, but he just had problems with perspective. And here we can find the copy I bought at an internet auction. And here we have an engraving made by Drevet, commissioned by Hyacinthe Rigaud himself, because he had the paintings of members of his family flatteringly set up so as to advertise to the people of the court. And this right here is a flyer. So now, here are some of the paintings that were stolen from us. There's a Rubens I had engraved, The Fall of the Angels. Another is Ducreux's portrait of a little lady by Greuze. I find this portrait extremely moving, and I'm not afraid to say that it was my first crush. Here, you have a painting from Murillo's entourage, from Chardin's entourage, and so on. It's all been stolen, and obviously it's the sole object of my resentment. Here, some memories of the Revolution with a photo of the Marquise de Cornulier, the Mademoiselle de Saint-Pern, who practically climbed onto the scaffold. She was in the cart and told the guards she was expecting a child. The guards pardon the expression, kicked her out, telling her, "You're working for your country, you don't belong here." And she was kicked off the cart. Her husband was beheaded, her sister, her brother-in-law, everyone was beheaded. Her life was saved because she was expecting a child. And that child was Toussaint de Cornulier, one of the nice men who made productive investments by buying the estate of the Duchy of Albret, which they'd heard about in the Lande department from a rather promising lad named Haussmann, who was a young sub-prefect in the area. They bought what is now the Landes pine forest. And it was they who planted this pine forest in a department that was nothing but an infamous swamp with snakes and mosquitoes. And they made the department so wealthy that one day Toussaint de Cornulier wanted to go from Paris to Mont-de-Marsan to sign some papers at a notary's office. So he planned to stay 4 days. He stayed for 26 years because he was told, but there's such and such a family, they can't work anymore, they're old, etc. There was no pension fund. He organized retirement for these people. He created public baths, etc. So much so that the people of Mont-de-Marsan called him the friend of the poor. And the friend of the poor has his portrait here. On occasion, the town of Mont-de-Marsan has borrowed his portrait to help rewrite the social history of their city. So it's all very interesting because we're right down to the nitty-gritty. It's about the reality of life and relationships with people. It's different from the history that's, I'd say, complacently told, either for or against. We're dealing with real-life social realities. So the dining room, unique as my resentment there too. So it's not very unique anymore because the dining room is too small. We can't accommodate more than 18. It would do me a lot of good if I could do big wedding dinners, but that's not possible. Well, that's how we live. It keeps us from having delusion of grandeur. And now we're going to take a staircase that has its place in history. It's the oldest staircase with the ramp at the right ever built, and the first to be built after the dismantling of the castles. It was the architect Blaise Leprêtre, whom I mentioned earlier, who built this staircase inside the Châtelet, which no longer functions as a Châtelet today. And then now let's climb a few steps to discover, to our left, the chambre d'honneur. So, you see, there's a step. In this chateau, there isn't a single real floor. There are 52 different levels. And this I was obliged to establish in response to the taxman's claim that we were undervaluing things on the grounds that we could turn the chateau into a luxury hotel. 52 levels with the risk to fall on the ground and the impossibility of having rolling tables or canister vacuum cleaners. No, there's no such thing as a luxury hotel. So it was all right. I still had to write to the Minister of Economy and Finance, who agreed with me. Anyway, I had my father, who was very old and blind, sign the letter. But he signed where I asked him to after reading the contents. The minister agreed with me. I can quote his name, Dominique Strauss-Kahn. Here we have a chimney with about 36 meters of flue, since there are about 16 meters, 32 meters, about 16 meters behind the facades, and another 16 meters in the framework. There are the Harcourt and Lenoncourt coats of arms, since Pierre d'Harcourt in 1544 married Marie de Lenoncourt. And there's the well-known d'Harcourt motto, Gesta verbis prevenient, deeds prevail over words. So this is the room we call the chambre d'honneur, with here a lacemaker's tile to evoke the widespread activity in our countryside of village ladies who made lace to make money. And there were lace merchants, notably in Courseulles-sur-Mer. Not so long ago, there was still the facade of a lace merchant's house. Now, you can't see the facade, but it's typically local lace, Courseulles lace, which is distinct from Bayeux lace, which is distinct from Le Puy lace or Alençon lace. So it's local lace. Local history is still present here. So you have a classic type of furniture. This bed is a copy. It's a copy of a four-poster bed. On the other hand, here we have something interesting, a tapestry from Brussels depicting Diana, goddess of the hunt, chasing a stag. This stag was the little shepherd Actaeon, who boasted to her that he was teaching her the art of hunting. But before that, he had spied the ladies bathing in the river. So she turned him into a deer so her own dogs wouldn't recognize him and devour him. And then, charitably, they come and finish him off with a few arrows. I don't know why, but back in those days, we liked bloody little stories to put children to sleep at night, just like the ones we're going to find on the landing, for which the Michelin Green Guide gives us a star. We've got 2 stars for the chateau, but the Green Guide gives 1 star to this little sculpted group. Judith and Holofernes. So I refer you to this book of the Bible, Judith and Holofernes. But here, what's quite tasty is the inscription that I read. Here we see the portrait of Judith the virtuous, as by a haughty deed cut off the smoking head of Holofernes, who the happy Jerusalem had undone. The smoking head is still smoking. She's just decapitated him. The blood spurts, trickles, and smokes in the night of this party organized by Holofernes, who intended to seduce the beautiful and courageous Judith. And you have a conclusion that evokes a Fernand Reynaud sketch. L'heureuse Jérusalem eut défait. Well, no, he didn't succeed in defeating Jerusalem. The little town of Bethulia defeated Nebuchadnezzar's claim to control the whole of the Near East under his sole authority. It's a beautiful story. But why did we love these bloody stories so much? Judith and Holofernes are everywhere. I have an engraving here on the same subject at the Hôtel d'Escoville I mentioned earlier. Blaise Leprêtre, he's the one who had this sculpture put in, and maybe he sculpted it. At the Hôtel d'Escoville, you have a full-length sculpture of Judith holding Holofernes' head at hip height. And you have another sculpture, a statue of David and Goliath, with Goliath's big head, reminiscent of Beethoven, at David's foot. And I've been told, albeit with reservations, that in terms of alchemy, decapitation promises rebirth. That's it. I'm not going to say any more on the subject because I might be venturing a little too far. But I've got a lot to learn, and that's what I like about being a conservative squire. I use this term because there was a Minister of Cultural Affairs, Jean-Philippe Leuc, who apparently gave a great deal of thought to the idea of creating the status of Châtelain Conservateur, aware as he was that the state could not take over all historic monuments. An owner is much better placed and more dedicated than an employee to maintain and run a chateau, and the status of Châtelain Conservateur would be a project worth pursuing. So here we are on the chateau's northeast tower, a place reserved for the initiated, named the Happy Few. It's a place from which you have a rather interesting view of the surrounding landscape, and which for me evokes memories of the 39-45 war that I didn't experience. But these roofs were perforated by shells fired by Canadians to make sure there were no machine guns hidden on this terrace, when they had spotted one of my first cousins who, having broken all the prohibitions, had shown the tip of his nose over the parapet. So excited was he by the profusion of totally unprecedented armored vehicles that were pouring in from the beaches of the Juno Beach sector, that is, Courseulles and Bernières-sur-Mer. But here, we are at the foot of the roofs whose frames are the highest in France. In other words, over the entire span of the roofs, they're 16 meters high. And you'll see from the inside if that's not impressive. I invite you to follow me. It's a bit of a roundabout way. But these frames are not just a roof. You can see that this was originally designed to be lived in. You can see traces of plasterwork, a cradle structure with spikes showing that there was small wood and that it was covered with plasterwork and a fireplace. An extraordinary thing about this chateau. In all the rooms that today look like attics, there were fireplaces. This one has been kept in place. It's no longer in very good condition. It's no longer functional. But in the other attics, there were fireplaces that my father had dismantled for use. Fireplaces from the 14th century, in my opinion, and that are used in other buildings and which are, I must say, very elegant. But here, it's hard to imagine how you'd get to this room because that's what it has to be called, given that today there's a little spiral staircase and it's interrupted. So this unfinished aspect, or at least the fact that it's been interrupted, is also part of the research that spices up my day-to-day existence, because wherever I go, I have unanswered questions, or questions for which I have an element of an answer, but not the whole answer. I must say, I don't think I'm to be pitied. So, in fact, I need to show you something important, and that's the installation of the original castle. Look here. You've got a big buttress here, pointed arches, which I don't know what they're there for. It's still an enigma to be solved. And we're about to arrive at the heart of the 1200s Castral complex. We've arrived through small rooms to the guard room. Why the guard room? Well, you'll understand. It's a room that's been shortened by a later wall. But see this room, we're in 1200. This is where all the castle's activity begins. Why is that? There are 5 staircases leading from this room. One staircase goes down to the pantry, another goes up to a gay tower, a third leads out to the Great Hall, a fourth goes up to the Court of Honor, and a fifth goes up where? Well, into the private apartments, but presumably now, since the Renaissance, to the Athanor. This little staircase leads to the place where alchemical experiments were conducted. I've only known this for a very short time. And then come and see, there's still here a walled passage. It's an underground passage. Well, it is walled, but we know it's an underground passage about which a lot of nonsense has been told. In reality, this underground passage allowed you to go under the ramparts and into a friendly house, the cider cellar. Eventually, it was a woman or a character disguised as a woman who went to fetch her broths of cider, but in reality went to get help if we were surrounded. And then, another detail, you have vaulted ceilings. This is early Gothic art. These are cross vaults. But they're still terribly basic. It's not very decorated, not at all, so to speak. Yes, a little there, but you have keystones with cylindrical holes from which bits of something appear. These bits of something were attachments corresponding to pulleys, which were used to hoist ropes that were attached to rings like this one. You can see them everywhere. So, as to have trays that protected all the goods you wanted to keep safe from damp and rats so that you could stock up and then leave for work. There are no wall-mounted fireplaces in this room because the wall-mounted fireplaces we're all familiar with weren't installed until the end of the 13th century. Here, we're at the very beginning of the 13th century or even the end of the 12th. By contrast, brasieros were used with charcoal. And here in particular, we can see a kind of window well. And this was probably the place to build a fire, with the smoke evacuating naturally through the window. So this was really the communication hub for the whole estate. Now we don't have much light, but we have alcoves, transepts, and here we read Auxerre Blanc, or in English, White Auxerre. 1774. So this was the wine cellar. It was the medieval pantry. But we have White Auxerre. Still, it's not bad. 1774. And I think I have some Bordeaux 1819. Well, the charcoal trace. Bordeaux 1819, but I don't know which vintage. I'd also seen other very nice Burgundy appellations in vintages several centuries old. There was Champagne. Meursault, 1832. And in 1833, but I can't make out what it is. Fearing to say the wrong thing. Then it's an old larder, probably dug out in the 14th century. Between the chateau and the chapel. So this, of course, it's impossible without electricity, with steps that need serious cleaning, because there's an undulating, beaten earth surface. You can't take the public there. So this really is an exclusive I'm offering you.
Une exclusivité que je vous offre.